Hey there, and welcome to the very first episode of Just Another True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Allie, mom of 3, lifelong bookworm, and the person my husband has been telling to just start a podcast already for the past 5 years because apparently I won't stop talking about true crime cases. From my reading nook to yours, I'm absolutely thrilled you're here for this journey. If you're anything like me, you found yourself staying up way too late, falling down research rabbit holes, or talking your partner's ear off about cases that just don't make sense. Well, now you can blame me for your sleep deprivation instead. Before we dive in, I want to tell you a little about what makes this podcast different. I'm not a former detective or a criminal psychologist. I'm just someone with a concerning collection of true crime books, a passion for research, and a perspective that balances meticulous investigation with real-life experience. When I research cases, I'm thinking about them not just as mysteries to solve, but through the lens of someone who understands what it means to fiercely protect the people you love. For this premiere episode, I wanted to cover a case that exemplifies why I started this podcast. A case with compelling evidence, including surveillance footage of the killer, but somehow remains unsolved years later. It's one that's haunted me since it first made headlines in 2016, filling 3 entire notebooks in my collection with timelines, evidence, details, and theories. Today, we're covering the tragic and bewildering murder of Missy Bevers. So, grab your beverage of choice, mine is a crispy Diet Coke in case you were wondering, and let's dive in. Before we delve into the crime itself, I want to take time to introduce you to Terri Missy Bevers, not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, complex person she was. This is something I feel strongly about for this podcast. We'll always start with the person, not the crime. Missy was born on August 9th, 1970, which made her 45 years old at the time of her death. She lived in Red Oak, Texas, a small city about 20 miles south of Dallas. Like so many of us moms, Missy wore multiple hats. She was a wife to Brandon Bevers, whom she'd been married to for 20 years, and a devoted mother to their 3 daughters. In my research into Missy's life, what struck me most was her passion for fitness and how she'd turned that passion into a purpose. But in the years before her death, she found her calling in the fitness world. She became a certified instructor for Camp Gladiator, a popular boot camp style exercise program, and later started teaching classes called Camp Gladiator Bold. I can so relate to this journey of rediscovering yourself after years of focusing primarily on family. This podcast here actually started as a tiny passion project scribbled in my notes app between soccer practices and grocery runs. There's something especially meaningful about finding your thing in your 30s and 40s, you know? It's like finally getting to know yourself again after years of being primarily someone's mom or someone's partner. According to friends and family, Missy was incredibly dedicated to her fitness career. She wasn't just going through the motions. She genuinely cared about her students' progress and well-being. She would often post motivational messages and workout tips on her social media accounts, encouraging others to join her classes. Her Facebook page, which I've spent a lot of time reviewing to understand who she was, showed someone who was enthusiastic about life. She'd post regular updates about her classes, share fitness achievements of her students, and occasionally give glimpses into her family life. There were photos of family vacations, her daughter's activities, and everyday moments that painted a picture of a close-knit family. What's particularly striking when you look through Missy's social media is how she engaged with her community. She wasn't just posting workout videos or before and after photos. She was creating genuine connections. She'd respond thoughtfully to comments. She'd celebrate others' victories. And she created a supportive environment where people felt comfortable sharing their struggles and their triumphs. In today's often superficial social media landscape, that kind of authentic engagement stands out. Friends described Missy as outgoing, positive, and someone who never met a stranger. She was known for her infectious energy and her ability to push people to achieve more than they thought possible. She'd often arrive early to welcome newcomers and stay late to offer additional guidance to those who needed it. Missy was also a person of faith. She attended Cowboy Church of Ellis County with her family, where she was an active member of the community. Her faith appeared to be an important aspect of her life, informing both her personal values and her approach to helping others. One aspect of Missy's character that I found particularly touching was her commitment to early morning classes. As a mom, I know firsthand how precious those early morning hours can be. It's often the only quiet time we get. Yet Missy regularly chose to use that time to help others on their fitness journeys. She energetically led groups through challenging workouts, and that level of dedication speaks volumes about who she was as a person. In the week before her death, Missy had been excited about a new fitness challenge she was planning to launch. She'd posted on social media about it, encouraging people to sign up and telling them how it would change their lives. That forward-looking perspective, that excitement about the future, makes what happened all the more heartbreaking. To understand the full context of what happened, I think it's important to look at the days immediately preceding Missy's murder. Sometimes the smallest details can provide important context, and I want to make sure we're painting the most complete picture possible. On Saturday, April 16th, 2016, just 2 days before her murder, Missy led a regular fitness class and, according to attendees, was in good spirits. She mentioned the upcoming Monday morning class that would ultimately be her last, encouraging regulars to attend despite the forecast of stormy weather. That same day, she reportedly received a strange LinkedIn message from someone she didn't know. While police have never released the specific content of these messages, they've been described as creepy and strange. This detail would later become a point of interest in the investigation. Something I find particularly intriguing about these messages is the platform itself. LinkedIn is primarily for professional networking. It's not typically where you'd expect concerning messages. Most troubling messages tend to come through more personal platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or direct messaging apps. The choice of LinkedIn as a medium is peculiar, and it might suggest someone who knew Missy in a professional context rather than personally. It's a small detail, but these nuances often matter in understanding a case. On Sunday, April 17th, Missy spent the day with her family. According to statements from her husband, Brandon, it was a typical Sunday. They attended church in the morning, had lunch as a family, and spent time together at home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just a normal family Sunday with no indication of the tragedy that would unfold hours later. That evening, Brandon left for a planned fishing trip. This trip had been organized well in advance and was nothing unusual for the family. Brandon and Missy communicated via text message that evening, with their last exchange occurring around 8 p.m. Later that night, at approximately 10 p.m., Missy posted on her Facebook page about the upcoming Monday morning class. She mentioned the forecast of thunderstorms, but encouraged her students to still attend, writing something to the effect of, "Weather will be yucky in the morning, but we'll still have boot camp." This post is particularly poignant in retrospect, a normal, everyday communication that gave no indication of the tragedy that would unfold just hours later. Missy went to bed that night, likely thinking about the class she would teach in the morning, unaware that someone was planning to end her life. Now, let's walk through the events of April 18th, 2016, as precisely as the evidence allows. I've spent a lot of late nights piecing together this timeline from police reports, news articles, and official statements, trying to create the most accurate picture possible. Sunday night, early Monday morning. Brandon Bevers, Missy's husband, was in Mississippi on a fishing trip. This alibi has been confirmed by multiple witnesses and was never in question. Missy was at home with at least one of her daughters. At some point, she went to sleep, planning to wake up early for her 5 a.m. class. Monday, April 18th, 2016. approximately 3:50 a.m. Security cameras at Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian, Texas, capture footage of a person dressed in tactical police-style gear entering the church. The footage shows this individual using a pry bar or tool to break into the building through a side door. 3:50 a.m. to 4:18 a.m. The intruder is seen wandering through the church corridors, opening doors to various rooms, including the kitchen area and offices. Their movements appear unhurried and methodical, as though they're either looking for something specific or simply exploring the space. At various points, the individual can be seen carrying what appears to be a hammer or mallet-like tool. What's particularly chilling about this footage is the casual nature of the intruder's movements. They don't appear rushed or nervous. They move with an eerie confidence, as if they have all the time in the world. I've watched this footage countless times, and that unhurried quality never fails to disturb me. It suggests premeditation and comfort in what they're doing, which is deeply unsettling. Approximately 4:20 a.m., Missy Bevers arrives at the church to set up for her 5 a.m. Camp Gladiator Bold fitness class. She typically arrived around 40 minutes early to prepare the space, set up equipment, and organize her class materials. Security footage does not capture the moment she encounters the intruder. 4:20 a.m. to 5 a.m. What exactly transpired during this time frame remains unknown to the public. At some point during this period, Missy was attacked and killed. This 40-minute window is where so many questions lie. Did Missy immediately encounter the intruder, or was she able to begin setting up before the attack? Did she recognize her attacker despite the disguise? Was there a conversation, or was the attack immediate? These are the questions that haunt me when I think about this case. Approximately 5 a.m. The first fitness class participants begin to arrive at the church. Several students enter the building. Eventually, they discover Missy's body in the main area where the class was to be held. 5:06 a.m. One of the students calls 911, reporting that their fitness instructor is on the floor, unresponsive, and bleeding. 5:13 a.m. First responders arrive at the scene and confirm that Missy Bevers is deceased. 5:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. Additional police units secure the scene and the investigation begins. The church is locked down as a crime scene. Morning hours. Brandon Bevers, still in Mississippi, is notified of his wife's death and immediately begins the journey back to Texas. Later that day, the Midlothian Police Department holds an initial press conference confirming that they are investigating a homicide at Creekside Church of Christ. I want to pause here to imagine what those first fitness class participants experienced that morning. They arrived expecting an energetic workout with their familiar instructor. Instead, they found a horrific crime scene. Many of these students knew Missy well. They had developed relationships with her, and suddenly they found themselves in the middle of a tragedy. The trauma of that discovery would impact their lives forever, creating a ripple effect of secondary victims beyond Missy's immediate family. The medical examiner later determined that Missy died from multiple puncture wounds to her head and chest. She had been struck multiple times with an unknown object, and her death was ruled a homicide. Some reports indicated that there was signs of a struggle, suggesting that Missy fought for her life. Every time I revisit this timeline, I get chills. As someone who's left the house in the early morning darkness countless times for airport runs, early morning hockey practices, or just to grab some quiet alone time at a coffee shop before the world wakes up, this strikes a particular kind of fear. That 40-minute window where Missy was alone with her killer, I can't help but think about her final moments and what she must have experienced. It's a stark reminder that we all need to prioritize our personal safety, especially during vulnerable hours like early mornings. The surveillance footage of the intruder is simultaneously the most compelling piece of evidence in this case and the most frustrating. Despite having clear video of the person believed to be Missy's killer, law enforcement has been unable to identify them. Let me describe this footage in detail, as I've watched it numerous times, trying to pick up on any clues that might help identify this person. The individual captured on camera is dressed head to toe in what appears to be tactical police or SWAT-style gear. They're wearing a helmet with a face shield that completely obscures their face, a heavy-set vest with what looks like insignia or patches on it, resembling police tactical gear, dark pants that appear padded or reinforced, dark shoes or boots, and gloves. The overall impression is of someone who has either law enforcement training or who has studied tactical gear and movements. The uniform isn't haphazard. It looks purposeful and complete. And yet, there are subtle inconsistencies that experts have pointed out. The gear doesn't match exactly what any specific police departments would use. It's as if someone put together pieces from different sources to create the appearance of official tactical gear without actually having access to a complete, authentic set. The person is carrying what police have described as a pry bar or tool, which they use to gain entry to the church. At various points in the footage, they're also seen carrying what looks like a hammer or mallet-like tool, though the exact object is difficult to identify with certainty. One of the most distinctive features, and one that police have focused on, is the person's gait or walking style. The individual walks with a distinctive shuffle, with their feet pointing outward as they walk. Some have described it as a duck walk. This unusual gait has been the subject of much speculation, with some suggesting it could indicate a medical condition, an injury, or even that the person might be a woman trying to disguise themselves as a man. Medical experts consulted by investigators have suggested various conditions that might cause such a walking style, from hip problems to certain neurological conditions. Others have proposed that the heavy tactical gear itself might have affected the person's natural walking style, especially if they weren't accustomed to wearing it. Some internet sleuths have even suggested that the person might be deliberately altering their walk as an additional disguise measure. The footage shows the person moving through various areas of the church, opening doors and looking into rooms. Their movements don't appear rushed or panicked. Rather, they move with a strange sense of purpose or curiosity. Some investigators have suggested this could indicate that the intruder was familiar with the church layout, while others have posited that they might have been looking for something specific. What's particularly chilling about the footage is that this person arrived approximately 30 minutes before Missy, suggesting they either knew her schedule or were planning to wait for whoever arrived first at the church. Either scenario points to a degree of premeditation that makes this crime all the more disturbing. Law enforcement has released multiple versions of this footage to the public over the years, including enhanced versions in hopes that someone might recognize the person's build, walk, or mannerisms. Despite thousands of tips, the identity of the person in the footage remains unknown. I have to say, I've spent probably hours studying this footage, as have countless internet sleuths, professional analysts, and of course, law enforcement. The fact that this person remains unidentified despite being captured so clearly on video is one of the most baffling aspects of this case. It's like having a puzzle with the most important piece still missing. While police have been understandably careful about releasing specific details of the crime scene, certain information has become public through official statements and court documents. The attack occurred in the main area of the church where Missy was preparing to hold her fitness class. Based on the evidence, investigators believe Missy encountered the intruder shortly after arriving at the church at around 4:20 a.m. According to the medical examiner's report, Missy suffered multiple puncture wounds to her head and chest. The specific weapon used has never been officially identified, though many speculate it may have been the hammer or mallet-like tool seen in the intruder's hand in the surveillance footage. There were signs of a struggle at the scene, suggesting that Missy fought against her attacker. This detail particularly breaks my heart. Imagining her fighting for her life in what should have been a safe space where she was simply trying to help others improve their health. Interestingly, nothing appeared to be stolen from the church or from Missy personally. Her car was still in the parking lot, her cell phone was recovered at the scene, and her purse and personal belongings seemed untouched. This lack of robbery as a motive has led investigators to believe the attack was personally motivated rather than a random crime of opportunity. The church itself had no security personnel on site at that early hour, which meant the intruder had ample time to enter the building and wait for Missy's arrival without being detected. This has led to changes in security protocols at many churches and fitness facilities that host early morning events. One detail that hasn't received much attention is the weather that morning. Remember, Missy had posted about the yucky weather for the class. It was indeed stormy in the Midlothian area, with thunderstorms moving throughout the night and into the early morning hours. This means that the intruder made their way to the church during inclement weather, possibly using this storm as cover for their activities. The noise of the rain and thunder might have masked the sounds of the break-in, and in the dark, stormy conditions would have provided additional concealment. The crime scene was processed extensively by Midlothian Police Department with assistance from the Texas Rangers and the FBI. They collected DNA evidence, fingerprints, and other forensic materials. However, to date, no matches have been publicly announced for any of this physical evidence. The investigation into Missy's murder began immediately and quickly became one of the most resource-intensive cases in the history of the Midlothian Police Department. Let's explore the various avenues investigators pursued and continue to pursue in their efforts to solve this case. Within hours of Missy's body being discovered, the Midlothian Police Department had secured the crime scene and began collecting evidence. The Texas Rangers, a state-level investigative agency, were called in to assist due to the seriousness of the crime and the resources needed for a thorough investigation. Crime scene technicians meticulously documented the scene, collecting DNA samples, fingerprints, footprints, and any other physical evidence that might identify the killer. They also secured the church's surveillance footage, which would become a crucial piece of evidence. For a smaller police department like Midlothian's, serving a city of around 30,000 people, a homicide of this complexity presented significant challenges. They typically handle only a handful of homicides per year, and most are relatively straightforward cases where the perpetrator is identified quickly. Missy's case, with its mysterious intruder in tactical gear and lack of obvious motive, immediately stood out as exceptional. The medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy on April 19, 2016, officially ruling Missy's death a homicide caused by multiple puncture wounds to her head and chest. On April 20th, 2016, just 2 days after the murder, the Midlothian Police Department took the unusual step of releasing portions of the surveillance footage to the public. This decision reflected both the difficulty in identifying the subject due to their disguised appearance and the hope that someone might recognize the person's distinctive walk or mannerisms. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the department had received hundreds of tips from across the country. People reported suspicious individuals, recognized the gait as similar to someone they knew, or offered theories about the case. Assistant Chief Kevin Johnson, who became one of the primary public faces of the investigation, described the challenge of processing this volume of information. Every tip has to be followed up on because you never know which one might lead to a breakthrough. But when you're getting hundreds of calls, that becomes a massive undertaking for a department our size. The FBI joined the investigation, providing technical assistance with enhancing the surveillance footage and analyzing digital evidence. They also helped process the enormous volume of tips that continued to pour in. One interesting aspect of the investigation was the evolving description of the suspect. Initially, police described the intruder as a man based on the build and height observed in the surveillance footage. However, on April 22, 2016, they issued a statement clarifying that they could not definitively determine the gender of the person in the footage. This shift led to speculation that the killer might be a woman disguised to appear male, or perhaps a smaller statured man. The ambiguity around the suspect's gender significantly expanded the pool of potential suspects and complicated the investigation. In an interview with local media, Chief Carl Smith explained the decision to broaden the description. "We don't want to limit our investigation by making assumptions. The tactical gear obscures many of the physical characteristics we would typically use to determine gender. We're asking the public to focus on the person's movements and mannerisms, rather than making assumptions about whether it's a man or woman." This development dramatically changed the direction of the investigation and public speculation. It opened up entirely new avenues of inquiry and forced investigators to consider a wider range of potential suspects. Investigators conducted a thorough examination of Missy's digital life, including her cell phone records, email accounts, social media profiles, and internet browsing history. They were particularly interested in this creepy and strange LinkedIn message she had reportedly received in the days before her murder. While specific details about these messages have never been released to the public, police have confirmed that they investigated this lead extensively. Whether these messages were connected to her murder remains unknown, or at least undisclosed. Digital forensics experts also analyzed the church's computer systems and security setup, looking for any signs that someone might have accessed information about the facility's layout or Missy's class schedule. They examined whether any unauthorized persons had accessed the church's networks or whether there had been any suspicious online activity related to the church or Missy's fitness classes. Additionally, investigators reviewed cell phone tower data for the area around the church during the relevant time period, hoping to identify phones that were active in the vicinity during the early morning hours when the murder occurred. This type of digital evidence has become increasingly important in modern investigations, sometimes revealing the presence of individuals who wouldn't otherwise be connected to a crime scene. As with any thorough homicide investigation, police examined Missy's financial records for any unusual activity or potential motives. They looked into insurance policies, bank accounts, debts, and any financial disputes that might provide a motive for murder. No significant financial motive has ever been publicly identified, though of course investigators may have information they've chosen not to share with the public. Financial investigations can sometimes reveal unexpected connections or motives. In some cases, victims may have financial entanglements unknown to their closest friends and family, business dealings gone wrong, loans that weren't repaid, or disputes over money. However, by all accounts, Missy's financial situation appeared relatively straightforward, with no obvious conflicts that would provide a motive for murder. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews with Missy's family members, friends, fitness class participants, fellow church members, and others who knew her or might have information about the case. Brandon Bevers, Missy's husband, was initially scrutinized, as is standard procedure in spousal homicides. However, he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. He was on a fishing trip in Mississippi, approximately 500 miles away, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence there. Cell phone tower data also placed him in Mississippi at the time of the murder. I have to say, I've always appreciated how transparent Brandon has been throughout this ordeal. He's given multiple interviews, cooperated fully with police, and continued to advocate for justice for Missy. Losing your spouse is devastating enough without finding yourself under the microscope of both law enforcement and public opinion. My heart breaks for him and their daughters, navigating both grief and this unresolved case. Investigators also interviewed Missy's fitness class participants, particularly those who regularly attended her early morning sessions. They were interested in whether anyone had noticed unusual activity around the church, any unfamiliar vehicles in the parking lot, or whether Missy had mentioned feeling concerned about anyone or anything in the days before her death. Church members and staff were interviewed about who might have had knowledge of the building's layout, their security systems, or access points. They were also asked about any unusual incidents or unfamiliar persons who might have shown interest in the church facility. One particularly intensive aspect of the investigation involved checking alibis for the early morning hours of April 18, 2016. Given the time of the murder, around 4 a.m., many people would have been at home sleeping, making their alibis more difficult to verify than if the crime had occurred during daytime hours. One of the most intriguing aspects of the investigation was the focus on the tactical gear worn by the suspect. Police issued specific requests for information about anyone who owned, had access to, or had recently purchased similar equipment. They checked with local police departments, security companies, military surplus stores, and online retailers that sold such gear. They also investigated recent burglaries where similar equipment might have been stolen. One such incident occurred at a nearby gun range around the same time as Missy's murder, where tactical gear similar to that worn by the intruder was reportedly stolen. While police investigated this potential connection extensively, they never publicly confirmed whether the two crimes were related. Investigators also reached out to military and law enforcement training facilities in the region, inquiring about individuals who might have had access to tactical gear through their professional connections. They checked with private security companies, SWAT team members, and others who might legitimately possess such equipment. This angle of the investigation produced numerous leads, but no definitive suspect. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to develop a profile of the killer. While the specific conclusions of this analysis have not been made public, behavioral experts who have commented on the case have noted several interesting aspects. The killer's choice to disguise themselves in tactical gear suggests premeditation and planning. The methodical way they moved through the church indicates someone who is either familiar with the layout or uncommonly calm during the commission of a violent crime. The fact that they arrived 30 minutes before Missy suggests they knew her schedule. The apparent lack of robbery or sexual assault as motives points to a personal connection or targeted killing. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, who has commented publicly on the case, though was not officially involved in the investigation, suggested that the level of planning involved points to someone with a personal connection to Missy. This doesn't have the hallmarks of a random crime. The perpetrator chose a specific time and place, came prepared with a disguise, and appeared to be waiting for the victim. That suggests someone who knew Missy's routine and had a specific grievance against her personally. Another behavioral aspect that experts have noted is the choice of weapon. If the hammer or mallet-like tool seen in the footage was indeed the murder weapon, this represents a very personal, hands-on method of killing. Unlike a firearm, which allows for emotional distance from the victim, a blunt or puncturing instrument requires close physical contact and multiple strikes. This type of violence often indicates strong emotional involvement or rage, further suggesting a personal connection. As of 2025, the investigation remains active. The Midlothian Police Department continues to receive tips, though at a much slower pace than the initial months after the murder. They periodically re-release the surveillance footage or issue new appeals for information, particularly around the anniversary of Missy's death. In April 2021, on the 5th anniversary of the murder, police released enhanced still images from the surveillance footage and reiterated that the case was still a priority for the department. They emphasized that even small details that might seem insignificant could be the key to solving the case. Despite the passage of time, investigators maintain that they are still actively pursuing leads and that they have not classified this as a cold case. Various rewards for information leading to an arrest and conviction have been offered over the years, currently totaling over $60,000. The department has also implemented periodic case reviews, where the evidence is examined by fresh eyes, sometimes bringing in investigators from other agencies who haven't previously worked on the case. This approach can sometimes identify angles or connections that were missed in the initial investigation. Over the years, several theories and potential suspects have emerged in Missy's case. I want to emphasize that I'm only discussing individuals or scenarios that have been publicly acknowledged by law enforcement or extensively reported in the mainstream media. I'm also careful to note that being investigated does not imply guilt, and no one has been charged with Missy's murder. Theory 1: targeted personal attack. The most prevalent theory among investigators is that Missy was specifically targeted by someone who knew her personally or was at least familiar with her routine. The evidence supporting this theory includes the killer arriving 30 minutes before Missy, suggesting they knew when she would be there. They waited for her rather than leaving after, exploring the church. Nothing was stolen, ruling out robbery as a primary motive, and the level of violence suggests a personal animosity. Under this theory, potential suspects would include people in Missy's life who might have had a grievance against her, felt wronged by her, or had some other personal motive for wanting her dead. Investigators look closely at Missy's personal relationships, including current and past friendships, professional relationships, and any conflict she might have been involved in. They examined text messages, emails, and social media interactions for any signs of tension or threats. A subset of this theory that has gained traction among some observers is the idea that the killer might have been a disgruntled fitness client or someone who felt threatened by Missy in some way. Perhaps someone who felt humiliated in her classes, or whose spouse or partner had developed an attachment to Missy through her role as an instructor. The fitness world, with its focus on physical appearance and self-improvement, can sometimes generate intense emotions and attachments that might not be immediately obvious to outsiders. While police have never publicly named any specific person of interest under this theory, they have indicated that they've investigated numerous individuals with personal connections to Missy. Theory 2: random act of violence or wrong place, wrong time. A second, though less commonly accepted theory, is that Missy was the victim of a random act of violence or happened to interrupt someone committing another crime. Under this scenario, the intruder might have been burglarizing the church or engaging in vandalism when Missy unexpectedly arrived. However, several factors make this theory less compelling. The intruder's tactical gear suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous crime. They arrived shortly before Missy, which would be an unlikely coincidence. Nothing appears to have been stolen from the church, and the intruder had 30 minutes to take valuables and leave before Missy arrived, but chose to stay. While investigators haven't ruled out this possibility entirely, most of their efforts appear focused on the targeted attack theory. One variation of this theory suggests that the intruder might have been using the church for some other illicit purpose, perhaps as a meeting place or to hide something, and Missy's arrival interrupted them. However, this still doesn't explain the tactical gear or the apparent targeting of Missy, who arrived at a scheduled time that would have been predictable to anyone familiar with the church's activities. Theory 3: a case of mistaken identity. Some have suggested that the killer might have intended to target someone else who regularly used the church facility and mistakenly killed Missy instead. Perhaps they were expecting a different church employee or another instructor who sometimes used the space. This theory might explain the killer's apparent confusion as they wandered through the church, possibly looking for a specific person or location. However, it doesn't explain why they would target Missy if she wasn't their intended victim, unless the encounter escalated unexpectedly. For this theory to hold water, there would need to be someone else associated with the church who had enemies or who was involved in a situation serious enough to motivate murder. Investigators presumably looked into other church employees, clergy, and regular users of the facility to determine if anyone had received threats or was involved in concerning situations. Theory 4: a connection to other crimes. Investigators have also explored potential connections between Missy's murder and other crimes in the area. Around the same time as Missy's murder, there was a burglary at a nearby gun range where tactical gear similar to that worn by the intruder was stolen. Police investigated this potential connection but have never publicly confirmed whether the two crimes were related. Similarly, they've looked into other unsolved homicides in the region to identify any possible patterns or connections, but no definitive links have ever been established. This approach, looking for connections between seemingly unrelated crimes, has solved many cases over the years. Sometimes a distinctive method, unusual weapon, or specific type of victim can link crimes that initially appear unconnected. Serial offenders often have a signature, and that can be identified across multiple crimes, even when the specific details vary. As I mentioned earlier, I'll only discuss individuals who have been publicly acknowledged in connection with the investigation. Brandon Bevers, Missy's husband, was initially investigated as is standard procedure in homicide cases involving married couples. However, his alibi was quickly confirmed. He was on a fishing trip in Mississippi at the time of the murder, with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. Cell phone tower data also placed him hundreds of miles away from the crime scene. Police have reportedly stated that Brandon is not a suspect. If I can speak candidly for a moment, this is something I want this podcast to be known for. I think it's important to address how quickly people jump to suspect spouses in cases like this. While statistics do show that partners are often responsible in domestic homicides, Brandon Bevers has cooperated fully with police from day one. He's given numerous interviews, maintained his focus on finding justice for Missy, and supported their daughters through this unimaginable tragedy. I've watched every interview that he's given, I think, and what I can see is a man devastated by loss and frustrated by the lack of answers, not someone with something to hide. This is something that I want to establish early on in this podcast. I promise that I will never engage in reckless speculation or accuse individuals without substantial evidence. While we will most certainly discuss theories and possibilities, I believe we can do so responsibly and with awareness that our words have real-world impact on people's lives. This is especially important in an unsolved case like Missy's, where the investigation remains active and public input could potentially help solve the crime, but only if that input is thoughtful and based on evidence rather than imagination. Let's talk more specifically about what physical evidence police have in this case. While investigators haven't disclosed all details, several key pieces of evidence have been discussed publicly. The most significant piece of evidence remains the church's surveillance footage showing the intruder. This footage captures the person entering the church, moving through the hallways, and opening doors to various rooms. It clearly shows their distinctive walking gait, their tactical gear, and the tools they were carrying. Despite the clarity of the footage, the person's face is completely obscured by the helmet and face shield, making visual identification impossible. Investigators have focused instead on physical characteristics like height, build, and especially the distinctive walking style. Over the years, enhanced versions of this footage have been released to the public in hopes that someone might recognize the suspect's mannerisms or gait. What I find particularly fascinating about this footage is that while it gives us so much information about the suspect, their movements, approximate size, the distinctive walk, it simultaneously conceals their identity completely. It's almost as if the killer is hiding in plain sight. They're right there on camera, and yet their identity remains a mystery. That dichotomy is at the heart of why this case is so frustrating and so compelling. While specific details about DNA evidence haven't been publicly disclosed, it's standard procedure for investigators to collect any biological material from a crime scene. This could include blood, hair, skin cells, or other materials that might contain the killer's DNA. The Midlothian Police Department has stated that they have collected physical evidence from the scene, though they haven't specified whether this includes usable DNA. If the killer wore gloves and kept their body fully covered with the tactical gear, they might have been careful not to leave behind genetic evidence. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have allowed for more sensitive testing and the use of genetic genealogy to identify suspects in cold cases. It's possible that any DNA collected at the scene could eventually lead to a breakthrough, even years after the crime. These advancements in DNA technology represent one of the most promising avenues for resolution in Missy's case. Techniques that didn't exist in 2016 are now routine, allowing for DNA profiles to be developed from smaller, more degraded samples than was previously possible. The genetic genealogy approach that famously identified the Golden State Killer is now being applied to cold cases across the country with remarkable success. The specific murder weapon has never been officially identified in public statements. Based on the medical examiner's determination that Missy died from puncture wounds to her head and chest, and the hammer or mallet-like tool seen in the intruder's hand in the surveillance footage, many believe this tool was likely the murder weapon. However, police have never confirmed this detail, possibly to withhold information that only the killer would know, a common practice in homicide investigations. The nature of the murder weapon, presumed to be a blunt object requiring close contact, suggests a crime of significant emotional intensity. Unlike shootings, which can be committed from a distance, killing someone with a blunt object requires proximity and usually multiple strikes. Criminal psychologists often point to this type of violence as indicative of personal animosity rather than a calculated, dispassionate crime. Beyond the physical evidence from the crime scene, investigators have examined Missy's digital footprint extensively. This includes her cell phone records and text messages, email communications, social media accounts and messages, the creepy LinkedIn messages reportedly received before her death, and her internet browsing history. This digital evidence might provide clues about who might have had a motive to harm Missy or whether she had experienced any concerns about her safety prior to her death. In today's interconnected world, our digital lives often contain crucial insights into our relationships. Law enforcement regularly mines this type of data for patterns or connections that might not be immediately apparent. A sudden change in communication patterns, unusual internet searches, or unexpected interactions can sometimes reveal tensions or conflicts that weren't visible to family and friends. Police have also examined surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras in the area surrounding the church, looking for vehicles that might have transported the killer to and from the scene. In May 2016, Midlothian police released a still image of what is believed to be a 2010 to 2012 Nissan Altima driving around early morning in the parking lot of SWFA Outdoors, a sports goods store located close to Creekside Church. The time of the murder, around 4 a.m., meant there were few witnesses or passing vehicles that might have noticed anything suspicious. This early morning timing likely contributed to the killer's ability to arrive and leave without being seen. This timing represents another layer of planning by the perpetrator. Choosing to commit the crime during the pre-dawn hours significantly reduced the risk of witnesses. Even in a suburban area like Midlothian, very few people would be out and about at 4 a.m., especially during stormy weather, as was reported that morning. One aspect of this case that's particularly intriguing is the mention of creepy and strange LinkedIn messages that Missy reportedly received in the days before her murder. While police have never released the specific content of these messages, their existence raises several questions. Were these messages threatening in nature? Did they come from someone Missy knew or a stranger? Did they contain information that would suggest the sender knew Missy's schedule or routines? Could they have been from the killer, possibly attempting to establish contact before the murder? LinkedIn is an unusual platform for harassment or threatening messages, as it's primarily designed for professional networking. Most concerning messages tend to come through more personal platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or direct messaging apps. The choice of LinkedIn as a medium is peculiar and might suggest someone who knew Missy as a professional. I'm particularly curious about why these messages were sent through LinkedIn rather than another platform. If the sender was trying to conceal their identity, LinkedIn offers fewer privacy protections than anonymous accounts on other platforms. If they knew Missy professionally, why not approach her in person? The choice of platform might itself be a clue to the sender's relationship with Missy. Perhaps someone who knew her professionally, but not well enough to have her personal contact information. Beyond these messages, Missy maintained an active online presence, particularly on Facebook. She regularly posted about her fitness classes, shared motivational content, and documented aspects of her family life. Investigators have thoroughly examined her social media accounts for any clues about who might have wanted to harm her or whether she had expressed any concerns about her safety. What's particularly notable is that there doesn't seem to be anything in Missy's online activity that would suggest she was worried or fearful in the days leading up to her murder. Her final Facebook post about the upcoming class, despite the forecast of storms, reads as entirely normal. A routine communication of a dedicated fitness instructor encouraging her students to attend despite inclement weather. This aspect of the case really hits home for me. As someone who maintains a fairly active online presence, especially with this podcast, I'm acutely aware of how much information we inadvertently share about our routines, our whereabouts, and our plans. I've become much more conscious about what I reveal online since researching cases like this one. I think there's an important conversation to be had about the vulnerability that comes with being a public-facing professional, especially for women. Fitness instructors, teachers, small business owners, anyone who needs to publicly share their schedule and location as part of their work faces a unique set of safety challenges. Missy's murder highlights the difficult balance between being accessible to clients and protecting personal safety. The location of Missy's murder, Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian, Texas, adds another layer of complexity to this case. Churches are generally considered safe spaces, sanctuaries even, which makes a violent crime in such a setting particularly shocking. Creekside Church of Christ is a mid-sized church located in a suburban area of Midlothian. The building includes a main worship area, classrooms, offices, and multi-purpose spaces, one of which Missy was using for her early morning fitness class. At that early hour, around 4 a.m., the church was empty. There was no security personnel on site, and while the building did have a security system with surveillance cameras, it didn't have monitored alarms that would immediately alert police to an intrusion. The surveillance system itself is an interesting element of this case. While it provided crucial evidence, it was essentially passive, recording the intruder but not triggering any immediate response. Many churches and similar facilities have since upgraded their security to include motion-activated alerts or monitored systems that can detect unauthorized entry in real time. The intruder's familiarity with the church layout has been a point of interest for investigators. The surveillance footage shows them moving through the hallways and checking various rooms in what appears to be a methodical manner. This has led to speculation that the killer might have been familiar with the church, perhaps a member, a former member, or someone who has attended events there. Alternatively, they might have conducted reconnaissance beforehand, either attending services or events at the church to learn the layout, or potentially by finding floor plans or other information online. Many churches post virtual tours or building information on their websites, unintentionally providing details that could be useful to someone planning a crime. The church had allowed Missy to use their space for her fitness classes for some time, and this arrangement was known within the community. Her Monday morning class at 5 a.m. was a regular occurrence, mentioned on her social media and known to her students. This public knowledge of her schedule and location could have made her vulnerable to someone planning to target her. Following Missy's murder, the church cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to their surveillance system and any other information that might help solve the case. The church community was deeply affected by the tragedy. with many members participating in vigils and memorials for Missy, despite the fact that she wasn't a member of that particular congregation. The crime also prompted many churches and other facilities that host early morning events to reevaluate their security protocols. Some installed additional cameras, improved lighting in parking areas, implemented security check-ins, or added early morning security personnel. There's something particularly disturbing about a murder in a church, a violation of a space that's meant to be safe and sacred. I think this aspect of the case contributed to the shock that it generated in the community and beyond. When violence intrudes into spaces we consider protected, it challenges our fundamental sense of safety in a profound way. Missy's murder sent shockwaves through the communities of both Midlothian and Red Oak, Texas. In these relatively small, tight-knit suburban cities, violent crime, particularly murder, was rare. For such a brutal killing to occur in a church, to a well-known and well-liked fitness instructor, left many residents feeling vulnerable and afraid. The impact was particularly strong among several groups. Missy's murder highlighted the vulnerability of fitness instructors, who often arrive at locations before dawn to prepare for early classes. Many instructors across the country changed their practices after hearing about Missy's case, bringing a buddy to early classes, informing someone when they arrived safely, or even carrying personal safety devices. Houses of worship across the region reviewed their security protocols in the wake of Missy's murder. Many churches installed additional cameras, improved lighting, or reconsidered how and when they allowed their facilities to be used by outside groups. The incident raised difficult questions for church leaders about how to balance their mission of being open and welcoming spaces with the need to ensure the safety of those who use their facilities. As a mother myself, I can tell you that Missy's case resonated deeply with moms and women in general. The reality that a woman could be killed while simply going about her daily routine, doing something positive for herself and others, struck a chord with many of us. The case sparked conversations about women's safety, particularly during early morning or late night hours. Many women reconsidered their routines, started using location sharing apps with trusted friends or family, or took other precautions after hearing about what happened to Missy. Beyond these specific groups, Missy's murder affected the entire community's sense of safety and trust. In the days and weeks following the crime, local businesses reported increased security concerns. Parents were more vigilant about their children's activities, and there was a general atmosphere of unease. The community responded with an outpouring of support for Missy's family. Vigils were held, memorial funds were established, and many people participated in fitness events dedicated to Missy's honor. This collective mourning and support demonstrated the community's resilience, but also highlighted the deep impact of Missy's murder on so many lives. In the days following Missy's death, over 1,500 people attended a candlelight vigil held at Midlothian's Heritage Park. Friends, fitness clients, and even strangers who had been touched by her story gathered to remember her. Several of her fitness clients spoke about the positive impact she'd had on their lives, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. A GoFundMe page established for the Bevers family raised over $30,000 to help with funeral expenses and to support Missy's daughters. Local businesses also held fundraisers, with proceeds going to the family or to organizations that were meaningful to Missy. I think what's particularly touching to see is how the community has continued to honor Missy's memory even years after her death. There's an annual fitness event called Miles for Missy, where people gather to exercise together, celebrating her passion for fitness and her spirit of encouragement. The way a community rallies around a family in tragedy, that's something that gives me hope even in the midst of such a horrific case. Missy's case quickly captured national attention, with major news outlets covering the story and the unusual surveillance footage of the tactical gear-clad suspect. The case has been featured on shows like Dateline NBC, 2020, and numerous true crime podcasts and YouTube channels. This extensive media coverage has both positive and negative effects on the investigation. On the positive side, it generated thousands of tips and kept the case in the public consciousness, ensuring that pressure remained on law enforcement to solve it. The widespread sharing of the surveillance footage meant that millions of people had the opportunity to see the suspect's distinctive walk and potentially recognize someone they knew. However, the media attention also led to challenges. The Midlothian Police Department, a relatively small agency, was inundated with tips, many of which were based on speculation rather than substantial information. Sorting through these tips required significant resources that might otherwise have been directed towards more promising leads. Police Chief Carl Smith addressed this challenge in a press conference about 6 months after the murder. We appreciate the public's engagement with this case, but we need to emphasize the importance of submitting only credible information. Our detectives have spent countless hours following up on tips that turned out to be based on hunches rather than evidence. The internet sleuth phenomenon became particularly evident in Missy's case. Online forums, social media groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to solving the murder sprang up, with amateur detectives poring over every available piece of evidence. While some of these efforts were well-intentioned and thorough, others veered into dangerous territory, with unfounded accusations against innocent people. Several individuals were publicly and incorrectly identified as subjects by internet sleuths based on flimsy connections or superficial similarities to the person in the surveillance video. These false accusations had real-world consequences, damaging reputations and even leading to harassment in some cases. As someone who's deeply engaged with the true crime community, I feel a responsibility to discuss cases like Missy's ethically and carefully. There's a fine line between wanting justice and unintentionally causing harm through speculation. I always try to remind myself and my listeners that behind every case are real people, victims, families, investigators who are affected by how we talk about these crimes. Armchair detecting, as I like to call it, can be valuable, but it needs to be done with humility and caution. This is something I want to establish as a cornerstone of this podcast from this very first episode. We'll explore cases thoroughly, but with respect for all involved and with an understanding of the limits of our knowledge. I believe we can be passionate about seeking justice without crossing ethical lines or pretending to know more than we actually do. That's my commitment to you as listeners. While I'm always careful to respect the privacy of victims' families, it's important to acknowledge the devastating impact Missy's murder has had on her loved ones. Based on public statements and interviews, we can understand some of what they've endured. Brandon Bevers, Missy's husband, has spoken publicly about the trauma of losing his wife in such a violent manner and the added stress of the ongoing investigation. In interviews, he's described the challenge of grieving while simultaneously supporting their 3 daughters through their own grief. In a particularly moving interview with a local news station on the 2nd anniversary of Missy's death, Brandon shared, "The hardest part is not having answers. The girls ask me questions that I can't answer. They want to know who did this to their mom and why, and I don't have those answers for them. That's what keeps me pushing for justice. They deserve to know." Brandon has also had to contend with being initially investigated as a potential suspect, as is standard in cases involving married couples. Though quickly cleared, the public nature of the case meant that speculation about his potential involvement continued on social media and in some corners of the internet, adding another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. Missy's 3 daughters, who were teenagers and young adults at the time of her death, faced the devastating loss of their mother during crucial periods in their lives. They've largely maintained their privacy, though they have occasionally participated in public memorials and events honoring their mother. One of Missy's daughters shared during a memorial event, "My mom was so much more than what happened to her. She was the person who taught me to be strong, to care about others, and to never give up on my goals. I try to live the way she taught me, even though it's unbelievably hard without her here." Missy's parents and extended family have also advocated for justice, participating in interviews and continuing to press for information that might lead to the killer's identification. What's particularly poignant is that Missy's family has had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible for her death remains free. They've endured years of investigation updates, renewed appeals for information, and the emotional roller coaster of leads that initially seem promising but ultimately don't lead to an arrest. Despite these challenges, Missy's family has shown remarkable strength and dignity. They've channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing scholarships in Missy's name, and supporting fitness events that honor her passion for helping others achieve their health goals. As a mother, one of my greatest fears is not being there for my children as they grow up. Missy's daughters had to navigate some of life's most formative years without their mom's guidance. College decisions, first serious relationships, career choices, all the moments where a mother's perspective is so valuable. My heart breaks for them and for Brandon having to be both mom and dad during such difficult times. Over the years, investigators have looked into whether Missy's murder might be connected to other crimes, either in the local area or more broadly. While no definitive links have been established, several similar cases have drawn attention. As mentioned earlier, around the same time as Missy's murder, there was a burglary at a nearby gun range where tactical gear similar to that worn by the intruder was stolen. Police investigated this potential connection extensively, but have never publicly confirmed whether the two crimes were related. The timing and proximity of these events naturally raise questions about a possible connection. If the same person was responsible for both crimes, it would suggest a level of planning that included acquiring the disguise specifically for the murder. Alternatively, the burglary might have been opportunistic, with the perpetrator later deciding to use the stolen gear for Missy's murder. In the months following Missy's murder, there were several reports of suspicious individuals at churches in the broader Dallas-Fort Worth area, some during early morning hours. Investigators followed up on these reports to determine if there might be a pattern, though no clear connection to Missy's case has been established. One particularly concerning incident occurred about 3 months after Missy's murder, when a church in Arlington, approximately 30 miles from Midlothian, reported an early morning break-in. While no one was harmed in that incident, the timing and target raised questions about a potential connection. Police investigated thoroughly, but have never publicly linked the crimes. Law enforcement has also examined other unsolved homicides in the region, looking for patterns or similarities that might suggest a connection. However, Missy's case has several unique elements, particularly the tactical gear disguise and church setting. It's worth noting that law enforcement agencies often share information about unusual or distinctive cases, particularly when they involve unidentified suspects. The tactical gear disguise is uncommon enough that similar cases would likely be flagged for potential comparison. One case that received some attention from internet sleuths was that of a 2017 murder of a woman in another Dallas suburb who was also associated with fitness activities, though police have never suggested the cases are connected. The circumstances are quite different. The victim was killed in her home, not in a public building, and there was no surveillance footage of the perpetrator. One thing that makes Missy's case so haunting is its uniqueness. The tactical gear, the church setting, the early morning timing, these elements don't fit neatly into typical patterns of violence. In my years of researching true crime, I've rarely come across cases with exactly this combination of factors, which perhaps speaks to the premeditation and personal nature of this crime. While Missy's case isn't officially classified as cold, the Midlothian Police Department maintains that it's an active investigation. It has now been over 9 years since her murder. As time passes, new investigative techniques and technologies offer hope for resolution in cases like hers. One of the most significant developments in cold case investigations has been the advancement of DNA technology. Techniques now allow for DNA profiles to be developed from smaller, more degraded samples than previously possible. If investigators collected DNA evidence from the crime scene, these new techniques might yield results where earlier testing failed. Like I mentioned earlier, genetic genealogy, the technique that famously identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, has revolutionized cold case investigations. This approach involves comparing crime scene DNA to profiles and public genealogy databases to identify relatives of the unknown suspect, then building family trees to narrow down potential suspects. While it's unknown whether suitable DNA evidence exists in Missy's case, this technique remains a powerful tool if applicable. Digital investigation techniques have also evolved significantly since 2016. Advanced algorithms can now analyze cell phone location data with greater precision, potentially identifying phones that were in the vicinity of the church at the time of the murder. Social media analysis tools have become more sophisticated, allowing investigators to better identify connections between individuals, track online activities, and detect patterns that might not be immediately apparent. One particularly promising avenue is the application of artificial intelligence to analyze the surveillance footage. AI systems can now detect subtle patterns in movement, gait analysis, body proportions, and other physical characteristics that might not be visible to the human eye. These technologies could potentially identify distinctive features of the perpetrator that weren't apparent in earlier analysis. Law enforcement periodically releases enhanced versions of the surveillance footage, sometimes using new video processing techniques to bring out additional details. They've also focused on the suspect's distinctive gait, consulting with medical and movement experts to identify possible conditions or injuries that might cause such a walking style. Another approach is age progression analysis of behavioral characteristics. While the suspect's face isn't visible, experts can analyze how behaviors, posture, and movement patterns might change over time, potentially helping to identify the person years after the crime. In April 2023, on the 7th anniversary of Missy's murder, police released a public appeal that included an enhanced analysis of the suspect's walking pattern, developed with the help of forensic gait experts. This approach represents a new angle on the existing evidence, looking at the same footage, but with specialized expertise that wasn't applied in the initial investigation. Perhaps the most important technique in solving cases like Missy's is simple persistence. Many homicides are solved years or even decades after they occurred, often because someone who held information finally comes forward. Relationships change, loyalties shift, and consciences weigh heavily over time. Someone who protected the killer in 2016 might be willing to speak now. Investigators continue to re-interview witnesses, review evidence with fresh eyes, and follow up on new tips, no matter how much time has passed. This persistent approach has solved many seemingly unsolvable cases over the years. I've learned something about persistence through my own life experiences. Sometimes the most important thing is simply not giving up, whether that's working through difficult challenges or staying committed to uncovering the truth. I have tremendous respect for the investigators who continue to work Missy's case year after year, never giving up on finding justice for her and her family. As of my recording this premiere episode in early 2025, Missy Bevers' murder remains unsolved. However, the Midlothian Police Department continues to emphasize that this is an active investigation, not a cold case. In their most recent public updates, investigators have indicated that they continue to receive tips, though at a much slower pace than in the initial months after the murder. They periodically review all evidence with fresh eyes and in light of new forensic techniques. Detective Kevin Johnson, who has been involved with the case since the beginning, stated in a recent press conference, "We have not given up on finding justice for Missy Bevers and her family. This case remains a priority for our department, and we continue to pursue leads and apply new investigative techniques as they become available. We still believe someone out there has the information we need to solve this case." The reward for information leading to the identification and conviction of Missy's killer has grown over the years, with contributions from various sources, including Crime Stoppers, private donors, and fundraising efforts. The current total stands at over $60,000, providing a significant incentive for anyone with knowledge to come forward. Annual memorial events continue to keep Missy's case in the public consciousness. Each April, around the anniversary of her death, there are renewed media reports, social media campaigns, and community events dedicated to her memory and to generating new leads in the investigation. The surveillance footage of the suspect continues to be one of the most viewed and analyzed pieces of evidence in any unsolved crime. This persistent interest gives me hope. With each person who views the surveillance footage, each share of Missy's story, and each discussion of the evidence, the chances increase that the right person, someone who recognizes the suspect or has crucial information, will finally come forward. Before we conclude this premiere episode, I want to take time to remember Missy, not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, complex person she was. Through my extensive research into this case, I've learned about a woman who touched many lives and left behind a powerful legacy. Missy's passion for fitness wasn't just about physical appearance or even health. It was about empowerment. Friends and students have described how she pushed them to achieve more than they thought possible, to believe in themselves, and to build strength, not just in their bodies, but in their minds and their spirits as well. As a mother, Missy was described as devoted and present. Despite her busy schedule, she prioritized her daughter's activities and interests. She was known to schedule her fitness classes around their important events and was actively involved in their school and extracurricular activities. Friends recall her proudly sharing stories of her daughter's achievements and the close relationships she maintained with them. Missy's faith was also an important aspect of her life. She regularly attended church with her family and integrated her spiritual beliefs into her approach to fitness, viewing the body as something to be respected and strengthened as a part of a holistic approach to well-being. In the years since her death, Missy's legacy has continued through various initiatives. A scholarship fund in her name helps young women pursue education in health and fitness fields. An annual fitness event, Moving for Missy, brings together hundreds of participants to celebrate her life through the activity she loved. Her former students have organized community fitness classes that maintain her encouraging, supportive approach. Perhaps most importantly, Missy's story has raised awareness about safety issues, particularly for women who work early morning or late night hours. Fitness facilities across the country have implemented additional security measures, buddy systems, and safety protocols, potentially preventing other tragedies. What strikes me most about Missy's legacy is how it exemplifies what so many of us hope for in our own lives, that we make a positive difference for others, that we model strength and compassion, and that our impact extends beyond our immediate circle. Though her life was cut tragically short, Missy's influence continues to ripple outward in meaningful ways. When I think about what makes a life significant, it's not length, but depth. The connections we form, the people we help, the positive change we create. By that measure, Missy led a tremendously significant life. Her murder robbed her of years she should have had, but it couldn't erase the impact she had already made or the legacy she continues to have through those she touched. This case, like all the cases we'll discuss on this podcast, offers important lessons about safety and awareness. I often think about what insights I want to share with people that I care about. I'd tell them, trust your instincts about people and situations that make you uncomfortable. Missy's case reminds us that danger can appear in places we typically consider safe, like churches or fitness centers. If something feels wrong, even if you can't explain exactly why, listen to that feeling. It's better to appear overly cautious than to ignore warning signs. I'd also emphasize the importance of awareness, especially during vulnerable times like early mornings or late nights. Simple practices like texting someone when you arrive at a destination, parking in well-lit areas, and being conscious of your surroundings can make a significant difference in personal safety. After researching cases like Missy's, these small precautions feel like essential life skills rather than paranoia. From everything I've learned about this case, what stands out to me is how many people continue to care deeply about finding justice for Missy. Law enforcement, family, friends, and even strangers on the internet. There's a collective determination to solve this case that hasn't faded with time. I believe someone knows something, whether it's recognizing that distinctive walk, remembering an acquaintance who suddenly got rid of tactical gear, or noticing someone's behavior change around the time of the murder. If you have any information, no matter how small it seems, please contact the Midlothian Police Department or Crime Stoppers. What makes Missy's case particularly haunting is the contradiction at its center. We can see the killer on video, walking through the church in a distinctive tactical gear with that unique gait, and yet their identity remains unknown. The evidence is simultaneously so close and so elusive. That tension has kept this case alive in the public consciousness for nearly a decade now, and I suspect it will continue to do so until it's solved. As we conclude this premiere episode, I want to acknowledge the profound loss that Missy's family continues to endure. Her daughters have grown into young women without their mother's guidance. Her husband has had to rebuild a life in the wake of unimaginable tragedy. Her parents, siblings, and extended family have experienced a hole in their lives that can never truly be filled. It's for them, above all, that I hope for resolution in this case. For those of us in the true crime community, Missy's case reminds us of the real purpose behind our interest in these stories. Not entertainment or morbid fascination, but a genuine desire for justice and for lessons that might prevent future tragedies. By keeping her story alive, by continuing to share the surveillance footage and the details of the case, we contribute in our own small way to the possibility of resolution. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the case. What details stand out to you? Do you have insights or perspectives that I haven't covered? This podcast is meant to be a conversation, not a monologue. So please reach out through the comments, send me an email, or meet me over on Instagram. I'll be featuring listener thoughts and theories in future episodes. And speaking of future episodes, thank you so much for joining me for this premiere. Next week, we'll be exploring another case that's haunted me for years. The mysterious disappearance of Brandon Lawson, whose cryptic 911 call only deepened the mystery of what happened to him that night on a desolate Texas highway. You won't want to miss it. From my reading nook to yours, this has been Just Another True Crime Podcast. I'm Allie, reminding you to hug your loved ones a little tighter tonight, and I'll catch you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend. Your support helps this podcast grow and allows me to continue bringing these stories to light. And remember, stay curious, but stay safe.